Before Esther was queen, before her name was ever spoken in royal halls, before courage was demanded of her, there was an empire, a vast one. The Persian Empire stretched farther than most could imagine. From deserts to rivers, from mountains to seas, it ruled over 127 provinces. And at the center of it all sat a king, not a gentle king, not a thoughtful king, but a powerful one. His name was Xerxes. King Xerxes ruled from the city of Susa, a palace built not for humility, but for spectacle. Gold-lined walls reflected torchlight endlessly. Silks draped every corridor. Servants moved silently, like shadows. Power here was not whispered. It was displayed. And Xerxes loved display. So he summoned officials, generals, princes, governors. For 180 days, he showed them his wealth. Not once, not subtly, but endlessly. Gold goblets, marble pillars, jewels without number, as if the empire itself needed reminding of who ruled it. When the days of display were complete, the king ordered a feast, 7 days long. Wine flowed freely, rules were loosened, judgment blurred. And in the height of his indulgence, King Xerxes made a decision that would change history. He summoned Queen Vashti, not for counsel, not for conversation, but to be displayed. Queen Vashti was beautiful, but she was also dignified. And when the king's command reached her, she refused. One word, no. The palace froze. In an empire where commands were law, where obedience was expected, where silence was safety, a queen had said no. The king's face burned with anger, not because he was denied, but because he was denied in public. The advisors whispered urgently, "If the queen is allowed to disobey," they said, "every woman in the empire will hear of it." Fear masqueraded as policy, and so Vashti was removed, banished from the king's presence, her crown stripped, her name erased from the throne. The palace returned to order, but something was missing. The throne beside the king sat empty, and eventually even Xerxes noticed. So the advisors suggested a solution. "Let a search be made," they said, "for young women from all the provinces, not queens, candidates." And so the decree went out. Far from the palace, far from politics and feasts, lived a young Jewish girl. She had no title, no influence, no protection. Her name was Esther. She was an orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai, a quiet man who sat near the king's gate and watched the world carefully. Esther did not know that history was already moving toward her. When the king's decree reached the provinces, Esther was taken, not invited, not asked, taken. She entered the palace not as royalty, but as property, among many, chosen by none, yet watched by God. The women were placed under care, perfumed, prepared, observed, and something unexpected happened. Esther found favor, not because she demanded it, not because she performed, but quietly, effortlessly. Those who saw her felt it, a grace they could not explain. And still, Esther remained silent about who she was, her identity hidden, her faith unseen, her courage untested. When the time came, Esther was brought before the king, No speech recorded, no performance described. Only this: the king loved her more than all the others, and so he placed the crown upon her head. Esther became queen, a Jewish orphan, wearing a Persian crown, because Esther's story was never about comfort. It was about timing. And somewhere in the palace, a man was rising, a man who hated the Jews, a man named Haman, and the den was forming, not of lions, but of law. Every day, as the palace awoke, as officials passed beneath archways of stone and gold, a man sat near the king's gate. His name was Mordecai. He was not powerful. He was not wealthy. But he was watchful. From his place near the gate, he listened. He observed. And one day he overheard something that would change the course of the kingdom. 2 palace guards spoke in hushed tones. Anger had taken root in them. Resentment had grown bold. They planned to assassinate the king. Mordecai did not hesitate. He reported the plot. The message reached Queen Esther. Esther spoke to the king. The plot was exposed. The guards were executed, and the event was written into the royal records. Then, forgotten. No reward, no recognition, just ink on parchment. Mordecai returned to the gate, faithful, invisible. Not long after, the king elevated a man named Haman. He was given honor above all other officials. His authority expanded quickly. His pride expanded faster. Every official bowed when Haman passed. Every knee bent. Every head lowered. Except one, Mordecai. Day after day, Haman noticed. One man standing while others bowed. One man unmoved. "What people are you from?" they asked Mordecai. "I am a Jew," he answered. Haman did not confront him. Not at first, because pride does not rush. It waits. Haman learned who Mordecai was, and that knowledge was not enough. Killing Mordecai alone would not satisfy him, so he aimed higher, wider. Haman decided to destroy all the Jews in the entire empire, men, women, children, not because they rebelled, but because one man would not bow. Haman approached the king carefully. "There is a people," he said, "scattered and different. They do not obey the king's laws." It was half-truth wrapped in fear. "They are dangerous," Haman insisted. The king listened. He did not investigate. He did not ask questions. He handed Haman his signet ring, and with it authority. A decree was written, sealed, set. On a single day, the Jews would be destroyed. When the decree reached the provinces, panic followed. Families wept. Communities mourned. In Susa, the city was confused. But Mordecai understood. He tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes, and he cried aloud in the streets. Esther heard of Mordecai's grief. She sent clothes to him. He refused them. Instead, he sent her the decree, the truth, the danger, the time. Mordecai sent word, "Do not think that because you are in the palace, you will escape." Silence followed. Then more words. "Who knows if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther had not been summoned by the king for 30 days. To approach uninvited was death. Even for a queen, Esther stood at the edge of a decision. safety, or obedience? She asked Mordecai to gather the Jews. "Fast for me," she said. "No food, no drink, for 3 days." Then she spoke the words that echo through history. "If I perish, I perish." On the 3rd day, Esther dressed in robes, not armor, not strength, beauty and vulnerability. She walked into the inner court. The king looked up. The room held its breath. The king extended his scepter. Esther lived. "What do you want?" he asked. "Up to half the kingdom." Esther did not answer immediately. Wisdom whispered restraint. She invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Haman left the banquet proud, joyful, until he saw Mordecai, still standing, still refusing. That night, his friends suggested a solution. "Build gallows," they said. "Have Mordecai hanged 75 feet high, visible to all." Haman smiled. That same night, the king could not sleep. Scrolls were brought. Records were read, and there it was, the forgotten act. Mordecai. The king frowned. "What has been done for this man?" he asked. "Nothing." And at that moment, Haman entered. That night, sleep refused the king, not because of worry, not because of guilt, but because God was already moving. Scrolls were brought. Records read aloud in the dim glow of lamps. Line after line, event after event, until one name stopped the reader's voice. Mordecai, the man who had uncovered the plot, the man who had saved the king's life. The king sat upright. "What honor has been given to this man?" he asked. The servants exchanged glances. "Nothing," they answered. "Nothing." The king frowned. Justice delayed had become injustice. At that very moment, Haman entered the court. His heart was light, his mind already rehearsing Mordecai's execution. The gallows stood ready. The king turned to him. "What should be done?" he asked, "for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman did not hesitate. Who else could the king mean? Haman spoke eagerly. "Dress the man in royal robes," he said. "Place him on the king's horse. Have a noble lead him through the city, proclaiming his honor." The king smiled. "Excellent," he said. "Go at once. And then do this for Mordecai the Jew." The words struck like thunder. Haman's face drained of color, but the command had been given. So Haman dressed Mordecai in robes meant for royalty. He placed him on the horse, and through the streets of Susa, the man who planned Mordecai's death was forced to proclaim his honor. Pride does not fall quietly. It shatters. That evening, the king and Haman attended Esther's second banquet. Wine was poured. The atmosphere was warm. Then the king asked again, "What is your request, Queen Esther?" This time, she did not delay. "If I have found favor," Esther said, "spare my life, and the life of my people." The rune stilled. "For we have been sold," she continued, "to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." The king's voice rose. Who would dare do such a thing? Esther turned and pointed. "This wicked man," she said, "is Haman." The word hung in the air. Haman trembled. The king stood and left the room in fury. Power had been manipulated. Trust had been betrayed. And when the king returned, He found Haman pleading at Esther's feet. The optics sealed his fate. Will he even assault the queen? The king shouted. The guards covered Haman's face, and someone spoke. There are gallows, they said, built for Mordecai. The king did not hesitate. Hang him on them. And so Haman fell, by the very instrument he had prepared for another. But a problem remained. The original decree still stood. The law could not be revoked. So a new decree was written. The Jews were allowed to defend themselves, to stand, to leave. Mordecai was honored, clothed in royal garments, his mourning replaced with joy. Throughout the empire, the Jews celebrated, not because danger had never existed, but because God had not been absent. Esther did not seek power. She accepted responsibility. She did not roar. She stood. And because she did, a nation lived. God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther, yet his fingerprints are everywhere, in sleepless nights, in delayed rewards, in quiet courage, in perfect timing. God does not always announce himself. Sometimes he waits. Esther returned to her life, not louder, not proud, faithful, and the feast of Purim was established, so the story would never be forgotten. There's something unsettling about the book of Esther, not because of the danger, not because of the villain, not even because of the decree, but because God is never mentioned. No burning bush, no parted sea, no prophet declaring, "Thus says the Lord." Just politics, power, risk, timing. And yet, everything aligns. If you've ever looked at your life and wondered, God, where are you in this? Esther understands you. Some seasons of life feel dramatic. You see answers quickly. Doors open suddenly. Miracles are obvious. But other seasons, they feel ordinary, political, complicated. You don't hear a voice from heaven. You don't see angels in the room. You just see circumstances. Esther lived in that kind of season. God never introduced himself in her story, but he was in the timing. And maybe that's the kind of season you're in right now. Esther didn't campaign to become queen. She didn't post her resume. She didn't strategize her visibility. She was taken, and somehow favored. Have you ever found yourself in a room you didn't ask to be in? A job you didn't plan for? A platform you didn't expect? A responsibility you didn't feel ready for? Sometimes elevation feels accidental. But in Esther's story, nothing was accidental. Promotion is rarely about comfort. It's often about preparation. And sometimes God places you somewhere long before you understand why. Mordecai told her something chilling. Don't think that because you are in the palace, you will escape. That sentence still echoes. How often do we think, if I stay quiet, I'll be safe. If I don't speak up, I won't lose anything. If I avoid the risk, I'll avoid the pain. But silence doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it slowly erases you. Esther had to realize that comfort is temporary if injustice remains unchallenged. Safety is not always obedience, and obedience is not always safe. Before she acted, Esther fasted. Not strategized, not posted, not retaliated. She fasted. In modern language, that means she paused. She centered herself. She aligned her heart. She quieted the noise. We live in a world that reacts instantly. Someone offends you? Respond immediately. Something scares you? Panic immediately. Something threatens you? Defend immediately. But Esther teaches restraint. Courage without clarity is reckless. Courage with surrender is powerful. What would change in your life if you paused before reacting? If you fasted from panic? From noise? From impulsive defense? Sometimes breakthrough begins in stillness. If I perish, I perish. That line is not dramatic. It is surrendered. Esther wasn't chasing heroism. She was accepting responsibility. In modern life, we often want guaranteed outcomes before we move. We want certainty. We want contracts. We want assurances. But obedience rarely comes with guarantees. It comes with trust. There are conversations you may need to have, boundaries you may need to set, risks you may need to take, not because they are comfortable, but because they are right. And sometimes growth requires you to say, if I lose this, I still choose integrity. My favorite part of the story is the king's insomnia, because it's so ordinary. No lightning, no earthquake, just no sleep. How many times has God moved in your life through something that looked small? A delayed email, a missed flight, a restless night, a forgotten file suddenly remembered. Divine timing doesn't always feel divine. It feels inconvenient. But sometimes the turning point of your life is hidden inside something that seems random. Esther never knew that while she fasted, a king was losing sleep. While she prepared herself, records were being read. You don't see what God is aligning behind the scenes, and you don't have to. Haman built gallows for someone else and ended up hanging on them himself. There's something deeply sobering about that. The weapon you build in pride can become the instrument of your own fall. In modern life, that might look like manipulation backfiring, dishonesty exposed, arrogance collapsing. Esther doesn't teach revenge. She teaches that justice unfolds without her forcing it. She didn't attack Haman publicly. She exposed truth calmly, and then stepped back. There's power in letting truth do its work. What's fascinating is this: God is never named in Esther, but he is visible in timing, memory, delay, favor, exposure, reversal, and maybe that's how he works in your life too. Maybe the reason you survived that season wasn't luck. Maybe the reason that opportunity came wasn't coincidence. Maybe the reason that door closed saved you. Maybe the reason you're restless is alignment beginning. God does not always shout. Sometimes he orchestrates. That phrase has been quoted so much it risks losing weight. But think about it personally. What if your current season, the job, the city, the platform, the influence, the challenge, is not random? What if your personality was shaped for this? What if your pain prepared you for this? What if your visibility isn't for applause, but for responsibility? Esther didn't ask for the moment. She stepped into it. There's a difference. Esther did not roar. She did not rage. She did not make herself bigger. She stood. Modern culture tells us strength is loud, but Esther proves strength can be composed. Strength can be strategic. Strength can be restrained. Strength can be prayerful. There is nothing weak about quiet courage. Purim exists so the story would never be forgotten. Why? Because survival deserves memory. In your life, what have you survived that you rarely talk about? The heartbreak, the depression, the betrayal, the financial fear, the uncertainty. You may be in a season where God feels quiet, unmentioned, unannounced. Esther proves something powerful. Silence is not absence. Hidden does not mean inactive. Just because you don't hear thunder doesn't mean heaven is still. God can work through political systems, delayed promotions, insomnia, paperwork, ordinary courage, and He can work through you. What if you are in your palace moment right now? What if you are being asked to stand, not for applause, not for drama, but for obedience? You don't have to roar. You don't have to fight wildly. You may simply need to stand. And because you do, someone else may live. God's name is never mentioned in Esther, yet His fingerprints are everywhere, in sleepless nights, in delayed rewards, in quiet courage, in perfect timing. God does not always announce Himself. Sometimes He waits, and when the moment comes, He reveals what He was doing all along. There's a verse in Romans 8:28 that many people quote quickly, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him. But what we often miss is this. It doesn't say all things are good. It says God works in all things. The book of Esther is proof of that. Nothing about that decree was good. Nothing about exile was good. Nothing about genocide being legalized was good. But God was working, not loudly, not dramatically, but precisely. Psalm 121 says, "He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." Isn't it interesting? The king couldn't sleep, but God never does. While Xerxes tossed in his bed, heaven was already awake. You may have had nights where sleep refused you too. Anxiety, questions, fear about what's coming. But the same psalm says, "The Lord watches over you, even when you don't feel watched over, even when you don't feel protected." Esther never heard God say, "I am here," but protection unfolded anyway. Mordecai's act of loyalty was written down and forgotten. Have you ever done something right and no one noticed? Have you ever stayed faithful and nothing changed? Galatians 6-9 says, "Let us not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." At the proper time, not immediately, not conveniently, but precisely. Mordecai didn't know that his forgotten faithfulness would return at the exact moment a gallows stood waiting for him. Some of what you've done in integrity feels buried, but heaven keeps records, and timing matters. Joshua 1-9 says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." But notice God didn't remove the battle from Joshua. He commanded courage in the presence of it. When Esther said, "If I perish, I perish," she wasn't quoting Joshua, but she was living it. Courage doesn't eliminate risk. It aligns you with obedience. And obedience sometimes means walking forward without knowing the outcome. That's not recklessness. That's trust. Proverbs 21:1 says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases." The king extended the scepter. The king lost sleep. The king remembered. The king reversed. From a human perspective, it was coincidence. From a spiritual perspective, it was sovereignty. You may not control systems. You may not control leadership. You may not control outcomes. But God can redirect hearts you never even speak to. That's what Esther shows us. Psalm 30:5 says, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." The night in Esther's story was long. Exile, oppression, threat, decree. But morning came. And when it did, it wasn't shallow happiness. It was survival. The same gallows that symbolized death became the instrument of reversal. Sometimes God doesn't just remove the weapon. He turns it. What was meant to shame you becomes part of your testimony. What was meant to destroy you becomes evidence of your survival. Genesis 50:20 says it clearly. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Esther is that principle lived out. One of the most uncomfortable things about Esther is that it's political. Courts, decrees, influence, power structures. We often prefer our faith stories clean and isolated from systems. But Esther reminds us that God is not intimidated by power. Psalm 75 says, "It is God who judges. He brings one down, he exalts another." Haman rose quickly and fell completely. Elevation without humility is unstable. But faithfulness, even when hidden, is steady. Esther was an orphan. No title. No inheritance. No protection. Psalm 68:5 calls God a father to the fatherless. The world saw an orphan. Heaven saw an instrument. Never underestimate how God can use someone who feels overlooked. David was overlooked. Joseph was imprisoned. Esther was exiled. But obscurity does not disqualify you. It often prepares you. Matthew 6 speaks about fasting quietly, not publicly, not for performance. Esther fasted before she acted. In modern life, fasting might mean something different, turning down the noise, stepping back from constant input, silencing the urge to react. Sometimes your breakthrough won't come from more action. It will come from deeper alignment. Here's something profound. The name of God is never mentioned in Esther, but the covenant people are preserved. Deuteronomy 31:6 says, "Be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Never, even when he is unnamed, even when he feels quiet, even when he seems hidden in policy and paperwork." God does not need credit to be present. He does not need applause to be active. Ephesians 2:10 says, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." Prepared in advance. Esther's moment didn't begin when the decree was issued. It began long before, when she was positioned. Here's such a time as this may not feel dramatic. It might look like speaking truth gently, choosing integrity quietly, standing when others bow, refusing to compromise when it costs you. And you may never know fully what your obedience prevented, but heaven does. Hebrews 11 speaks about people who lived by faith. Some saw victory. Some endured suffering. All were commended. Esther's story ends in celebration. But the deeper victory was this: she chose obedience. and obedience is success in heaven's language. If you are in a season where God feels quiet, remember Esther. If you are in a season where injustice feels loud, remember Esther. If you are in a season where your obedience feels risky, remember Esther. God may not announce himself in your story, but his fingerprints are everywhere, in sleepless nights, in delayed rewards, in quiet courage, in perfect timing. And just because you don't hear thunder doesn't mean heaven is silent. Sometimes God waits, and when he moves, it is precise.